Well, hello, everybody. Good evening. Happy Tuesday. That's right, it's Tuesday again, which means it's story time night. And tonight we're going to be reading Chapter 4 of The Hammer and the Sun. As always, let me start out by talking a little bit about what happened in Chapter 3. So, in Chapter 3, Rock and Elof started their journey across the sea, following where Kara had gone. And they had fairly smooth sailing for a while. They, had to weather some storms and things like that, but the ship they were in was well built, and they did just fine. Then, out, couple weeks out, they ran into some Equesh ships. No idea how they got there into that ocean, but clearly searching for them. And the ships started a chase of them. They started to basically travel north. Yeah, let's call it northeast. So that way they could get into the ice flows to try to remove the pursuit. And basically, it wasn't doing any good. They ended up getting almost cut off by another ship. And so they started doing things that would help them to survive. They, rode into a bay, and a gigantic ice cliff was dropped down, attempted to be dropped down on them, but ended up hitting some of the other ships. They chopped into an iceberg and caused it to flip upside down, splintering, some other Equesh ships. And then Elof took the wind vane that he had made and he threw it into the ocean, and basically summoned up Amakak the Devourer, who proceeded to make short work of the other two Equesh ships once they attacked it. But while they were paying attention to Amakak, they were not paying attention to where they were sailing, and ended up crashing onto the ice. So that is where we will pick up the story this week. As a reminder for everybody, you can go out to my YouTube channel. Let me put the link up here for you. The YouTube channel is going to have all of the previous chapters that I have recorded, including the first two books, The Anvil of Ice and The Forge in the Forest. All available on my channel there. I have a live reading playlist that you can go into and find any of them that you have missed as time has gone on. I would also ask that if you guys would, in addition to going out there and viewing them, if you are enjoying the reading that I am doing, I would love if you could give a like to the videos as well. And if you feel so inclined, subscribing to the YouTube channel. Subscribing to a YouTube channel is free, so it will cost you nothing, but will help me to continue to grow that channel. And I've clearly had somebody come along who disliked either the reading that I'm doing or something else that I do on my channels, and has gone through and, basically disliked the last 12 videos. So if you enjoy them and you like the videos, I would appreciate a thumbs up on it, so that way we can get them moving in the right direction for any of that. I appreciate you guys. And now, go ahead and sit back, relax, prepare to enjoy as we will move ourselves into Chapter 4 of the Hammer of the Sun. Chapter 4. The High Gate. Rock tore his eyes away from the heights above and tugged his fur jacket closer about him. Well, how long before they come for us, do you reckon? At first, Elof could not understand the question. So numbed was his mind by the mere presence of the ice. Even standing on the deck, he seemed to feel something of that sickening, burning pain that contact with it had always brought him. The very air ran like fire in his nostrils, already raw with the cold, and pulling up his scarf made little difference. Come for us? Then he realized who Rock meant, but was carefully not naming, and as he considered, he felt a sudden flicker of warmth awaken. You know, they may not be able to find us so easily. Rock raised a skeptical eyebrow. They're not daft. They've only to look, haven't they? Elof rounded on him. That's just what they can't do. They've senses we haven't. They're aware of us, yes, but they can't see us. Not as we would see, anyhow. They managed just fine when they dropped that cliff, didn't they? Only with their thrall's sight to guide them. And even then they weren't close enough, were they? He scanned the cold cliffs in the graying light. We're too small for their minds to grasp. Even at Tapaiao, we were only shadows, and these will be far less attuned to live things than he. They can only gain living senses by taking on living shape, and that'll be their last resort. Rock grabbed him by the shoulders. You mean we've still time? Then what are we standing here for? Let's get this hulk afloat again. But it was scarcely that easy. First, most urgently, they had to haul in the sail, leaden heavy with water and already half frozen, and disentangle it from the jumble of twisted cordage around the fallen mast. Then they had to clamber down into the bilges, which, poor seamen that they were, they had failed to clean out often enough. There to struggle through slime and stink by the light of a sputtering lamp to check the hull for damage. They found less than they feared, but several seams had been sprung, and Rocks at once set to work melting their small store of pitch on the stove, while Elof went back on deck to begin what Rock could not do, dismantling the ruined rigging and reeving new lines where needed. From time to time as he worked, he would glance up at the sun, now resting like a red-hot brazen shield upon the rim of the ice cliffs. He wondered, almost idly, how much of the day remained, and how they would fare after dark. The powers of this place hated and feared the sun, however weak, and were doubly formidable in its absence. Beneath him the hull boomed and quivered to the thump of Rock's caulking mallet. It was the only sound not born of wind and wave, and to Elof's ears it seemed to echo around the cliffs above. Surely the powers must sense that as tremors in the ice, if nothing else. It was a great relief to him when it stopped, and a minute later Rock emerged, streaked with pitch and slime, gasping with exhaustion. Elof helped him up and found him a flask of wine. Enough, Rock wheezed. Must have been just about shouting come and get us to 'em, with all that row. Probably, Elof agreed. Couldn't be helped, though. But you finished? Good. That was hard on you. Not so light on yourself, grimaced Rock, looking at Elof's raw and bleeding hands. At least I was out of the cold. What now? The mast? If you're strong enough. I'll manage. Manage they did, though raising that mast can have been no easy task, even with block and tackle. Neither of them had the advantage of height, and had they not both possessed the sinews of smiths and an exceptional endurance, they might well never have achieved it. The sun was setting by the time the mast stood stepped, and the headsail at least was made ready to rise. But by then, Rock, who had had the heavier labor of caulking, was near to collapse. "Come on," encouraged Sheloff, as they warmed themselves over the cooling stove. "We've only to launch her now, that's all." "Got to rest," mumbled Rock. "Just a minute. Arms won't move." He slumped down against the stove and curled into himself. "All right," said Elof and sighed. "I'll keep watch, but remember, a few minutes may be all we have." Pulling his furs tight, he scrambled back up on deck and peered anxiously overside at the fearsome water that washed and gurgled under the scarred hull, lurching it a little on the ice shoal. It was hard to make out the tide on this mockery of a coast, but it seemed to be more or less at its height. They could hope for no more help from it. He could rig some sort of spring cable, such as the Corsairs had used to launch their ship, but that required a fixed point somewhere, a very strong one. Elof swallowed. There was no getting around it. One of them, at least, would have to get down hip deep into that fearsome water and wade ashore. And it could not be Rock. In his exhausted state, the sea might kill him. Elof was hardly more sure of himself, but he knew he had little choice. There were things abroad to which death might well be preferable. Swiftly he set about gathering gear, made fast a long line about his waist, and lowered himself gingerly over the curve of the hull. Only as his feet touched the water did he realize he had not told Rock what he was doing, but left him sleeping. He hesitated, but decided not to turn back. The longer Rock could rest, the better, he reassured himself. But in truth, he feared that if he once turned back now, he would lack the courage to try again. The bite of the water about his legs was fearful at first, smiting the breath out of him. Yet after that, it seemed possible to endure. Down he clambered, shivering uncontrollably, fearing the touch of the ice below. He had reason. It felt as if his boots touched molten glass, and he almost put his teeth through his lower lip with the effort not to scream. For long seconds, he could only cling to the hull timbers, cursing his own folly. He should have let Rock go. Rock would not have felt this nerve-searing. Nobody did but he. Why? Was it the smithcraft of fire within him? Yet the master smith had trodden the ice freely. Perhaps like other votaries of the ice, that dark creature had welcomed the pain, treated it almost as a mark of honor, a special summons, or a call. What the master-smith Mylio had endured, then, so could the master-smith Elof Valantor. Hammering away at his will as he might at toughened steel, he set his back to the hull, took up the slack on the line, and took a stiff, staggering step forward. He had moved not a moment too soon. Already his legs were deadened, tingling masses, hard to control. He would have fallen on that glassy slickness if he had not been able to dig in the heavy metal spikes he carried for support. But after only a few strides, he was already rising into the shallows and scouting about him for a suitably flat spot. Choosing one with no rough edges to chew and fray rope, He plucked the great hammer from his belt, tapped a spike to seat it, and then drove it down deep with a few tremendous blows. The other he drove in a few paces further on, wound the line around the two stanchions, and straightened up with a sigh. The wind was rising once again, rolling down over the cliffs above, and he peered up at them uneasily. Who could tell what he might have awakened now? But with so sound a leverage point, he could almost launch the Seafire by himself, in minutes. He squinted suddenly, pulled off a glove to rub his tired eyes. Was he staring at shadows in this dismal half-light? He was sure he was not. Something had moved atop the slope there, at the notch which led between the lowest cliffs. He cursed, turned to get back to the ship, then stopped, hesitated. He was afraid of what might rush down upon him while he was off his guard in that water. And the pain in his limbs was almost an exquisite thing now, fair and clean as a flame. His head whirled with it. He must see. He must know. With a savage growl, he drew the dark sword Gorthar, and with his hammer in his other hand, he stumbled up the short slope. Once or twice he glanced around to see that the cutter was all right, but not often. The slope demanded all his attention, and once or twice he had to fall on all fours and crawl. The agony in his hands almost made him laugh aloud. At last, as he reached the crest of the pass, some shred of his wits he won back, and with a flash of fear and anger he understood. He had been drawn here. He had been summoned. Cautiously, fighting down the piercing ache, he shuffled over into the shadow of a riven pillar of ice, stood up, and looked out to the openness beyond. He had seen the ice before, but at its landward margins only. He had marveled at its bitter beauty, bright as a hoard of jewels and as perilous. But this was a new aspect. He saw a flat plain that seemed to reach out to an infinite horizon, broken by nothing save a few low hills, gray against the twilight sky, as if they had been painted on it with shadows. Nothing moved on that plain but low wind. Rows of powder snow, too cold even to lie and compact with the rest, rustling in the wind as if to mock the soft sigh of growing things. Here, nothing grew. Not the humblest mold or lichen. No feature was different from another. Hill, plain, snow were all one single uniform thing. Forms without meaning, movement without life. The flakes that danced before his eyes were swelling, thickening, but the one that melted to nothing upon his palm had as much meaning, as much identity, as the whole vast expanse before him. They were made of the self-same thing, no more, no less. As free water, it had been forever in motion, flowing, evaporating, and condensing. It had been a vital link in the great chain that was life, and it had had a beauty of its own. Yet, what was it as ice? Frozen into a single shape, a fair shape indeed, but incapable of adding to or enriching that beauty. A snowflake was the opposite of a seed, of a thought. It could spawn nothing. It was merely an end in itself. It might endure till the end of all years, and then still be no greater, no less than it now was. Standing in the failing light upon that lonely ridge, he knew that he had looked into the deepest heart of the ice, void of the glamour it might lay upon itself, and that he had found there only the ultimate sterility. It was not reverence that lowered his eyes before it. He thought back to the halls of summer and the undying ones that Tapayao sheltered. Exactly as they were, the ice was immortal and useless. What could it be that bred in so many powers this need to hinder the passing years? A dread, perhaps, of themselves? Of their own inability to cope with any new order? Then he looked up swiftly, for it was as if a curtain was flung over his eyes. A rush of snowflakes blotted the last light from the sky, and he was lost in featureless grayness. He ducked down a moment in breathless panic, and it was as well he did. Across the slope of the ridge he saw a shape move, and it was like the shadow of a man in a dark robe, with a high hood drawn low across the face. But this shadow was immense, and it drifted, as on some wind milder than the blast which blew. Past him it glided, higher than the mast of his ship, the peaked cowl nodding with a slow regularity that seemed anything but benign. He had seen gelatinous things drift thus in clear waters, pulsing things that could sting and envelop. He shrank away, quaking, lest it chance upon him as it swept by. Across the ridge it advanced, nodding slowly, and near his side it appeared to stop and turn, as if casting about in the growing blizzard. He grew deadly afraid that it might start down the slope, and clutched at his sword hilt, though unsure what effect it could have. He had seen something like this once before upon the great ice, and in evil company. But whether it was material enough for any blade to bite on... The wind howled impatiently. The shadow floated on behind the swirling snow and vanished behind the arm of the pass. Elof waited only long enough to be sure it had really gone before hurling himself down that steep ice slope, not stopping to climb, but skidding so fast he had visions of overshooting the ship and sliding into the sea. But his fur snagged and tore and slowed him, and he arrived at the shore on unsteady feet, caught up the line he had wound around the stanchions, and plunged unhesitatingly into the water, drawing Gorthar to support himself. Up the hull he clambered, and so great was the release when his feet left the ice that he almost fell back in. Rock, roused by the booming of his climb, came staggering up on deck to help him in.
"Amazin' what a little rest'll do for a weary man,"
he began, but Elof cut him short. "Take this a turn around the stern capstan, Rock, and back here quick. We've got to get off. They're coming."
"Are they? By hella!"
exploded Rock, and rolled off along the deck. Elof hung, gasping for the minute it took him to return, and together they looped the line around the winch. "Now!" snarled Elof, and began to crank the winch. It wound freely a moment, taking up the slack, and then it stopped dead as it encountered the weight of the hull. Rock threw his weight upon it, the winch creaked, and they felt the hull quiver and shift a little under them.
"Shall I get overside and shove?"
wheezed Rock, the veins starting out under his thick fringe. The hull lurched upright, the line slackened a moment, and hummed taut. "No, not much use. A good-sized boat," gasped Elof, feeling as Rock had that his arms would not obey. "Just keep." There was a sudden grating rasp beneath them, too like the sound they had made grounding in the first place. The boat heaved, and they hauled harder before they realized it was sliding of its own accord. Next moment, they were hurled to the deck as it bucked and bounced under them.
"Sail!"
gurgled Elof, clutching at his side where his sword hilt had bruised a rib, and together they crawled forward to raise the headsail they had rigged ready. The blast of the blizzard shook it and filled it, and swung them violently around. Jubilantly, Elof seized the tiller and let the sail out further and further, till it goose-winged out. The Seafire sprang forward, frisky as a tired horse let loose among fresh green meadows, and went skipping across the troubled waters as if it had never been aground, running brisk and easy before the wind off the ice. The water slapped resoundingly at the hull, but there was no ominous sound of filling, and the little craft rode level and true.
"We're away,"
said Rock, as if he hardly believed it, and then, exulting,
"Karis's Gate, we are away."
"Not yet," said Elof absently, for he had to concentrate on controlling the cutter. "We've yet to see if we can raise the mainsail. Then we've got a good 3 leagues of pack ice to get through, and in the dark." Rock caught his arm and pointed so vehemently astern he had to risk a look. The high cliffs were walls of shadow now, as darkly cold beneath the rising moon as they were pale and chill by day. But above their summits the ice glow burned, and shooting through it in bands of furious color blazed the North Lights, a banner and a challenge. Fierce as they burned above the promontory the cutter had escaped from, and by their eerie glow Elof and Rock saw something move. Yet this was nothing above the ice, such as Elof had encountered, nor even on it. Something was within it, as bruised beneath raw skin, a patch of shadow, a pool of dark liquid that flowed beneath the glinting surface of the ice, freely and swiftly. Down the slope that Elof had climbed it poured, and out across the promontory. One long portion stretched out in front of it like an arm. Suddenly, the shore lit up with an appalling flash of green light, and they saw green flames leap like lightning between the steel stanchions Elof had left, saw the strong metal sag and melt like candles of tallow, and metal run in spitting rivulets across the ice. It cracked explosively, and again, filling the air with bright shards, and suddenly the crack was racing across the whole promontory, wider and wider, till with a rumbling roar the whole mass of it split free and dropped like an avalanche into the sea.
"No more, if you please,"
said Rock hastily.
"We're leaving, believe you me. We're leaving."
And indeed, though perils enough yet lay in their path, from those blazing crags no further assault came. In the first clear stretch of channel they uncovered their lantern and hoisted the mainsail, bending its battered tackle as best they could, and holding their breath while the remounted mast took the strain of the snow-laden wind. But it held firm as ever, save for some stretching of the stays which they foresaw and dealt with. Thus, as the long night wore to its close, they were scudding back along the channels as easily as they had come. Elof steered with nervous precision, but he could not avoid every encounter, and they winced at each judder in the bows, each rasp and scrape along the cutter's flank. Every hour or so, one or the other would check the hull, but, though it creaked and groaned more loudly than before, the Seafire was shipping only a little more water than was usual through the working seams. To right and left of them the tall ice islands glided, but being blown southward by the same wind, they were more easily avoided or outpaced. As the stars faded and pale light crept up along the ocean's rim, they cast about anxiously for any trace of black sails, but there were none.
"You took us a good way further east as well as north,"
said Rock thoughtfully.
"I guess we've passed a cordon and left any other searchers behind."
"As I had hoped," said Elof quietly, keeping a wary eye on the thinning ice around them. "But what was that cordon guarding, I wonder? And how far have we yet to sail, if we can?" Rock made no reply to that, for though the little cutter bestrode the waves as lightly as ever, they were both aware that they could no longer rely on it as they had. Sound it might seem, yet it had been most terribly stressed, and probably damaged in a dozen ways that they could not hope to detect. Not, at any rate, until the constant warring of wind and water around every sailing boat had worked upon the weakness and made them serious. And then there would be little or nothing that could be done afloat. Only on a boatyard slip, or at worst a favorable beach, was there a chance of repair. The two travelers sailed forth from the clutches of the ice, yet they were not free. It had laid a sentence upon them more implacable than any edict of a human king. Find land within a certain span, or find their last long rest beneath the seas of that sunrise. And what that span was, they were not told. That day and night the snow pursued them, and, fearing it would grow to a storm, they set their course southeastward in all haste. Those were hard hours, for the seas waxed high and rough, the wind gusty and fierce, and the little cutter juddered alarmingly in that double embrace. Wild flurries of snow came lashing across the deck, coating the rigging, caking in every cranny, rushing across their faces till they could scarcely breathe, let alone see. They could feel and hear the working of the hull timbers, and it was no cause for comfort. Yet, for all her wounds, the Seafire rode out the weather gallantly. As the sun arose, the snow faded, as if in disgust, and they fell to bailing and caulking anew. Yet there were distractions enough from their concerns in the days following. As they quitted the marches of the great ice, life seemed to return to the sea, and they no longer felt quite so isolated from the world of warm blood. Seabirds were still rare, yet from time to time fine winged shapes could be seen against the clouds, gliding high beyond the reach of any. Seals of all kinds were common, bobbing up in the seas or sunning themselves on wide floes. By night their cries could be heard for many long sea miles, eerie and yet strangely melodious, and with a yearning quality that spoke deeply to Elof. Once or twice, too, they saw the huge white bears that hunted them, padding across the floes with their low heads swinging, or actually swimming between them. They seemed too much creatures of the land to be able to survive in that appalling cold. Strangest sight of all, though, was a group of creatures that Elof at first took for some kind of large porpoise, from their gray backs and speed of swimming. But as they cut across the Seafire's bow, he saw that those backs were dappled, that the tall flukes were rounded to the shape of a fan, and more strange than any, that they had a single long spear of a horn set slightly to one side of their heads, which rose and fell at a vicious angle as they swam. Elof and Rock found it only too easy to imagine one crashing through the Sea Fire's distressed timbers, with many tons weight of whale behind it. Curious as they were, they kept a respectful distance and never saw the beasts again. High winds still blew, constantly, but they scoured the skies clear. Elof and Rock looked eagerly astern as each night fell, for they hoped to see the ice glow fading from the sky. So it did, astern. Yet it seemed to linger curiously in the eastward sky off their port flank, glinting on the gray clouds that rolled imperiously by, till Elof, alone and gloomy on night watch, wondered despairingly if it were not somehow reaching out to bar their path. He knew the idea was idiotic. It could not move so far, so fast, and would have crushed them directly if it could. Yet there it was, reaching out like the pallid tentacle of some sea beast. Something flickered by him, a thought almost too swift to grasp. He had it. Always, always, the ice strove furiously to reach as far south as it could, so those cliffs he had trodden must have been the limit of the glacier's reach, out here at sea. In which case, what were they seeing to port? There were still ice islands about. Could a great mass of them make such a glow? Surely not. So if the ice there reached further than it could at sea,
"Then by hell, it's not at sea,"
said Rock forcefully, when he came on deck near dawn.
"There's land over there."
Land under the ice, Elof reminded him dryly. It may still be far away. The ice might curve in towards it, as it does north of Morvenhall, only further. The tales say that east of the oceans it did reach further south. That was why Caris the Great was founded, when the ice drove out the ancient kingdoms of men in the Old North, forgotten now in the deeps of time. And then its advance on Caris drove folk from there to settle in Bracehall, to find Morven there, and our own homelands. He frowned, feeling suddenly slight before that creeping, inexorable advance. Rock. That was some 4,000 or 5,000 years past. Who knows how far it's come now? There may be no land there at all.
"There's something,"
shouted Rock, springing up and squinting into the growing light eastward.
"See there? Breakers! A shoal! It's land right enough."
It couldn't be so close, objected Elof, puzzled, and he clambered up onto the unsteady rail beside Rock. But he could not deny what he saw. All over the wide seas eastward spread a great turbulence. White water and spray spurting like breakers over some rough coast of black rocks. And behind it, a low line of shadow that might indeed be distant hills. Then they both saw at the same time that the shoal was moving, that the apparent rocks were shining serpentine backs, glossy and wrinkled, rearing and plunging with the strength of living waves. The spray was the jetting vapors of their breath, blasted from cavernous lungs. They had seen whales before, but never so many and so large altogether. Like breakers indeed churned the bow waves around their blunt-walled heads, and the foam about their flukes. Elof eyed them suspiciously, but when he saw that they would pass well south of the cutter, he grew thoughtful. One piece of good tidings they may bring us, Rock. I've heard that the great whales never herd so in cold waters. We may be coming to warmer climes at last.
Not before time, then.
Rock grunted and waved a hand at the hatchway. He had no need to say more. They could both hear the heavy slopping of water below. And yet they had bailed it out with great labor only the evening before.
And all their news may not be so good. If those aren't hills behind them, they're clouds. And filthy black ones, too.
Elof glanced at him, and read in his lined brow the same fear. It was early summer now, a time when, along the coasts of their own country, where the cold air off the ice met the warm winds from southern lands, fierce storms were common. Elof stood silent a while, but at last he shrugged. Well, what can we do but endure it? We'll have to turn in towards the land, storm or no storm, ice or no ice. As if to punctuate his words, the sea beneath the clouds glittered gray a moment, and a full minute later a rumbling rolled across the waves, like a cascade of stones. Elof breathed deeply. He could almost smell the lightning on the racing breeze. Come, we better go batten down all, reef the sails, and gather some gear together. Such things as they might need on shore, such things as they might risk drowning to save. But that he left unsaid. The slow complaint of the timbers was eloquent enough. The storm advanced like a dark mantle drawn up the sky.
You see,
Rock pointed out,
Smith's clouds, right enough.
Elof smiled wryly at the old Nordeny folk name, only too apt. The high crests of the thunderclouds were flattened and peaked like vast anvils, their bases hidden by the rain clouds that rolled and boiled like sooty forge smoke. Flashes leaped among the peaks, and he thought of the image of Ilmarinen in the Duergar halls, master of masters, smith of the powers who smote out the very mountains. On such anvils might he work, with such storms for a fire. His hand crept to the precious gauntlet of mail at his belt, the sword slung opposite. Once he had dared to intrude upon that forge, to use some fragment of its strength. Sheer presumption, like so much else he had done. Now he must hope to dash through its midst. "Ready about!" he called, and saw Rock wind the witches furiously. They had sailed as far south as they could. To sail across the storm would only lengthen their time within it, increase their chance of being sunk. As well head straight into it, and hope that somewhere beneath it lay the land. Slowly, smoothly, he swung the tiller across. It was as fierce a storm as they had faced in all their time at sea. All around them, closer and closer, the lightning stabbed and flickered through the driving rain. The wind's sharp gusts raised ever greater waves that plucked up the cutter's bows, bursting athwart them in vast wings of spray that were lit molten silver by the levin bolts. Down their steep slopes it plunged as if to dash its bows into the trough, while the thunder drummed like harsh laughter overhead. But due rather, as Elof suspected, to her fair shaping than his own seamanship, the little ship rode out each trough and climbed each crest anew. Even over the bellow of the storm, they could hear her timbers creak and moan, as from the pain of old wounds reopened. Now and then cracks like snapping bone. Yet for all those wounds she held firm. even when they were forced at last to strike the sails all together from the tortured mast, and struggling and slipping with ropes along the storm-lashed deck, toss out an improvised sea anchor to hold the bows into the wind. Then they could do no more than lash themselves at their posts by tiller and rail, and bow their heads to the wind and their destiny. But that was the worst, after which the storm soon slackened, and as it passed, and the heaving waters turned from black to gray, they found themselves blinking in the light of a cloudy afternoon.
2 or 3 hours that was,
gasped Rock indignantly.
That's all.
Elof sagged down over the tiller.
Seemed like an eternity, didn't it?
Then he pulled himself weakly up. Rock, we've got to check the hull. Rock pushed him back with a grimace.
Sit tight. You had the worst of it at the helm there. I'll check. You gather your strength. Maybe you'll be needing it,
he added as he undogged the hatch and disappeared below. He emerged a short while later, fouled and grim.
You'd better come. I've never seen the seams work so. There's no getting the caulking to hold, and we're shipping water faster by the minute.
Elof glanced up at the sails, racked the tiller, and staggered past Rock and down. All the seams were indeed working loose, the more so the lower down he checked. It shouldn't be so. Unless... He stooped into the blackened slime at the bow and ran his hands slowly and carefully along the huge timber that was the keel. Some third of the way along he stopped, pressed his fingers down, and felt back along. His hands were half numbed by the filthy water, but his blood ran colder yet. "Rock," he said when he could, "I know why she's working so much. The heel's cracked. The keel's cracked."
"What?"
roared Rock.
"Can't be. She'd have broken up at once."
"Not right through, but with every wave. The ice did it. It did get us, after all."
"We can't brace it? Patch it?"
"It's past that. Filling faster by the minute. Within the hour, a few minutes maybe."
"Back on deck," growled Rock. "This stench softens my brain."
Elof sighed as he climbed up after him. "As you will, though there's little enough to think on now."
"That's so, eh?"
Rock's red thatch was thrust back down the companionway.
"Up here with you a minute. Now, tell me truly, what do you think that is?"
Elof scrambled up into the gray light and peered the way Rock was pointing. On the eastern horizon there lay a smoky-hued smudge no different from 100 other cloud banks, save that its high crests. He had to swallow hard ere he could speak. "It's land," he said softly. "A league and a half, at least. 2 if those are mountain tops."
"Can we make it?"
demanded Rock bluntly. Elof shook his head mutely, choking down the bitterness rising in his throat. "She'd pull apart the moment we hoisted sail. We might make it on a raft or swimming with floats, a spar or a hatch cover."
"Scant chance of that, with it so freezing and us weary. We'd never last long enough. Hell, but it galls me. I've got this far. There's no other way?"
They could feel the little cutter settling under them now with every pressing second. "There is by the high gate," blazed Elof. "Rock, take up your gear, and swiftly." For answer, Rock dragged a bundle out from under the thwart and slung his bow across his back, with a closed quiver of arrows.
"And yours?"
"All about me," said Elof, eyes sparkling. The cutter lurched sideways suddenly, and they staggered to the rail. "It's that will serve us, if you think you can hold tight for a half-hour or so."
"For my life? Like the grip of the ice its own self. But what to?"
"To me!" cried Elof. "Follow!" And springing up on the port rail, he sprang for the sea. Rock shook his head only once before he scrambled after. They rose together, gasping from the water's chill.
"Could have slung my furs,"
gurgled Rock. "No need," cried Elof, and dashed the salt sea from his eyes. "See, our Seafire lists, true friend that she was. We'll need to be out from under, fast, or follow her down." He was delving in his jacket as he spoke, and drew out with a cry of triumph a thing that glittered in the murky air.
"Hela's claw!"
Rock yelled, but was cut off by the rush of water against the cutter's deck. "Hold you tight now," shouted Elof, and drew the metal about his brows. The cold sting of it seemed to surge through him. He shuddered, and felt the water boil around his massive limbs. Dimly, a protesting shout reached him, and he remembered to stay still a moment, felt a weight at his side, arms close around the roots of the high fin at his back. Then he kicked out once, and was away. The sea surged behind him, and he was aware of the long mass that slid slowly down into the green depths. But he forgot his brief flicker of grief in the rushing joy of the waters. He had taken this shape for its strength, and because he had worn it briefly once before, hoping that might help him endure it longer. He had not bargained for the gradual change it brought to his perceptions. Sight and scent dimmed, but a strange new awareness filled his mind that had some aspect of hearing about it, and some of sight. A world of floating shapes it drew him, swaying and darting, suspended among shimmering swirls and currents. A world of beauties and mysteries he could only guess at. It allured him to dive down, to explore all the marvels half guessed at in this alien setting, this otherworldly sea. So strong was its call, he came dangerously close to forgetting his burden, and in panic he forced the new sense from his mind. Lifting his head above water, he could dimly make out the shore, and that way he drove, acutely aware of how little time he had. Already his thoughts were beginning to blur, to waver with the strain of maintaining the mask. Sooner or later it would slip, and be hard to regain. On he swam, the world an unregarded wonder about him, save for the weight that dragged at his back, and the explosive outburst of his own breath. The current came as a shock, a sudden upsurge, warmer than the rest, that lifted him suddenly and dashed him forward the way he was headed. His eyes lifted above the surface, and suddenly they saw only too clearly the high and jagged barrier outthrust before them. In a sudden flash of panic, he thrust out his hands to stave it off, and they were human hands. The mask had dropped, and his heavy clothes were dragging him down. He heard one sharp cry from Rock, felt the hand clutch at the soaked furs on his shoulder and tear free in the swirling water. He reached out blindly. There was only water and scouring, scraping stone. The surf threw him against it, dragged him back, threw him again. But this time he caught it, gripped and clung though it scraped the skin from his finger, clung as his legs were dashed against the stone. He let the flow carry him to a foothold. Then, with one desperate heave, he kicked and hauled himself up ere the undertow could pluck him away again. Clasped tight to the stone as the next wave roared over him like green glass, and painfully pulled himself to a secure hold. Only then, gasping with effort and the chill of the water, could he spare a moment to look up. He found that he was crouching on a long spit of jagged black rock, one of many outthrust into the sea by a coastline that was all rough cliffs, sculptured strangely by the sea that besieged their walls. He scrambled hastily higher, beyond the reach of the waves, and stood up, scanning the sea and the rocks around, ready to dive back in at the slightest glimpse of any form. He could see nothing living save himself, and the few gulls that swooped and screeched about the wild air. "Rock!" he yelled, over the drumming of the surf, and again, many times, till his salt, raw throat protested. A gust of cold panic closed over him, and he scrabbled back up the rocks, higher and higher. Yet from every new point of vantage he saw no more, nor were his calls answered. He looked up desperately at the promontory above. It would be no hard climb, and it would give him a commanding view. As swiftly as the thought, he set his weary limbs to the rock face. There was some snow on the ledges, and he wondered briefly if he would find the ice beyond the cliff top. But when he thrust over a hand for some hold to draw himself up, his fingers closed upon coarse plants and earth that was relatively soft. He scrambled more confidently over the rim and stood a moment, staring around. It was a bleak landscape that met his eyes, cold and hard, a rounded expanse of rocky, stone-littered slopes, and vales clad in somber shades of brown and purple. But it lived. Its colors were those of tough grasses and flowering scrub, moorland hues not unlike the Starkenfells of his Norderney home. In the valleys there were clumps of green, and here and there a stand of stunted birches. But all over the slopes there were thick patches of spiky gloss green, dotted with yellow flowers. A great clump of these bushes rose near him, and he knew they were a kind he had never seen before. It was only then that he fully realized what he had done, that he had crossed the sundering oceans, come to the lands of the ancient East, first among men to do so in well nigh 1,000 years. And he had taken a great step on his quest, yet desperately he wished it undone. So bitterly it stuck in his throat. This way and that he gazed from the crest of the promontory, out to sea, along the cliffs and the little beaches that nestled below him. He could see clearly and far, yet he saw nothing that he wished to. No trace of any human shape. Again and again he called, but his voice alone challenged the gull cries over the bleak land, the empty sea. At last, he slumped down at the cliff edge and sank his head in his hands. He was beyond the release of mourning, of tears. The void that opened at his feet seemed less than that within him, and his loneliness infinite. Love lost, homeland renounced, friends forsaken. And now he had doomed his oldest friend, failed to save at this one crisis the man to whom he owed his life many times over. His life. What use was it to him? All that he had won with such effort he had tossed away. He sat here on a barren coast, in no better case than if he had never quit his hovel upon the great marshes, half a world away and many long years. Worse, for there he had its shelter at least, the means to live, and a guilt he could hope to expiate. Here he had... What did he have? Sword, hammer, pack with its precious burdens, all hung at his side. Yet something was missing. He lifted his fingers cautiously and clutched his salt-stiffened hair in tearing handfuls. There was no helm on his head. There had not been, he knew now, since he had climbed from the rocks. Nor was it about his neck, for he had fastened it only loosely in his haste. The loss shook him rigid. Yet he would have laughed it off to find his friend alive once more. The sky above descended on his shoulders, and it was made of granite harsher than any beneath. But it was not so very long before he raised his head again. If there were the least thing he could do, he should do it. One folly did not excuse others. He must search for what he had lost. The Tarnhelm had almost come ashore with him. It would be folly to abandon it so easily. It could not have borne him across the oceans because he had never seen this shore and could not hold its image in his thoughts. But now he had. If he could find it, it might serve to bear him back, though the distance involved unnerved him. Brihon Briheren had traveled across the ice with it, but only in short stages, with rest. He could not rest in mid-ocean. Meanwhile, there was a little food in his pack. While that lasted, he would search for rock. The clouds parted a little. The sun, still hidden, shed long beams over the land, touching the hilltops with a sudden glow of warmth, but shining cold upon the green waves and the steely peaks of distant islands. He watched the sea a while, noting the run and flow of the surf that had borne him ashore, and how it varied and shifted with this wind. Alive, Rock should have come ashore somewhere near. Dead, he still might. The place most likely was a beach some way down the cliff from the spit he had climbed, wider and less steep than the others he could see, and leading up to a shallow valley, a depression in the cliffs filled with bushes and birch that had grown straighter than was usual here in its shelter. And yet the wind seemed to be stirring them now. There was movement in those bushes. Too much to be just one man. And yet among the dark foliage there was a brief but definite flash of red that could easily be the hue of Rock's hair. He leaned forward, eager to shout or wave, yet hesitant. Whatever moved would be out in the beach in a moment. Then he could see. If it was Rock... It was! He sprang up as the square, burly figure emerged from the bushes, cautiously as if expecting trouble. Elof waved, hailed, and saw him start, look up, and wave back. No ordinary joyful wave, but a scything, flattening gesture, urgent, sinister. Danger, come down. Or did he mean stay out of sight? Elof half turned, hesitated, caught a glimpse of armor, copper skin, as a great weight ground down on him and forced his face into the earth. With sickening suddenness, as if not a moment had passed, he was back in the last day of his childhood, some 25 years ago, taken unawares by the raiders who had ravaged his village. But now, though he was weary, there was strength in his arms, Smith's strength, and as they were wrenched behind him, he struggled and snarled and fought. He jerked one arm the way it was being pushed, felt his attacker lose his balance, and thrust out once again. The hard hands tore free. The man was flung back, but there was no sound of him striking the ground, only a rattle of loose earth and stone, a terrified shriek, and a moment later, a thudding splash from below. The other attacker hesitated. Elof swung around, seized the fingers that held him, and twisted them back. The man let go with a scream, and Elof was on him with fists swinging. He sprang up as another came running with spear leveled, seized the shaft, and snapped it with bruising strength across his knee, then fell on the spearman with the bladed truncheon. But as he raised it for the killing stroke, another blade passed across his throat. One more prickled his neck below the ear, and a narrower blade jabbed him painfully over the kidneys. He let fall the truncheon and rose very slowly to his feet. The faces of the men running up, hard and brown and scarred not only by wounds, but by ritual cicatrices, were all too familiar in their cast. With bow, spear, and sword, a ring of Ekwesh warriors hemmed him in. Ekwesh! Till then, confused in time, it had seemed only natural that he was fighting his lifelong foes. But now the implications pierced him like a catapult bolt. For a crazed moment, he wondered if he might not have somehow sailed on around the world to the Ekwesh homeland. It was said to be a bleak place like this, but he knew better than that. What, then, were they doing here? His blood still boiled, and he had half a mind to try and break through their ranks and run for it. He might make it, but then they would comb the area, and might capture Rock. Better to wait, bide his time. A broad man in a fur-trimmed cloak strode forward, cheeks hatched between cheekbone and jaw with a chieftain's scars in the shape of wings, and gestured at his pack and sword belt. Elof did nothing. Two warriors dropped their weapons, seized him, and tore the pack from his shoulder. Elof thought of the hammer at his side. If he could keep it from their sight. One warrior tugged at the buckle of his sword belt, and Elof made a furious lunge for the hilt, struggling with the men who held him. It availed him little, but it was not meant to. The scuffle lasted only a minute, and ended with Elof on the ground being kicked with iron-shod boots. But the hammer was tucked safe among his furs. The chieftain gestured him up, and Elof lurched to his feet more unsteadily than he needed to. Let them be off their guard only a moment. The chieftain caught his arms and spread them wide, then ran long fingers through his jacket and gave a grunt of satisfaction. He plucked out the hammer and hefted it before Elof's face.
"You are a soldier?"
he demanded, in some barely comprehensible form of the southern tongue. "No," spat Elof, then reined in his temper, remembering the exaggerated prestige this Reaver people attached to its warriors, and their contemptuous treatment of any who were not as fair game. "That is, I am when I have to be, but by choice I am a smith." The chieftain's face was blank. "A shaper, a shaman of metals." It was the Ekwesh word he used, and the chieftain drew back as if he had trodden near a copperhead. He spat on the ground and gestured to the others, and they searched Elof from top to toe. He ground his teeth as the chieftain fingered through his precious pack, knowing what dangers lay in the jewels he bore. The chieftain plucked out the anklets and the half-arm ring, admired them a moment, and to Elof's astonishment, replaced them, handing him the pack.
"You carry this for now," he said. "Answer with your head."
He spoke with an atrocious, guttural accent, but better than other Ekwesh Elof had heard. Also, he used terms that had a strangely literary or archaic ring to Elof, and others he could only guess at.
"So, you speak for self now. Then before Iltasia."
Elof knew some words of the Ekwesh common tongue, but that one he had never heard. "My ship sank out there," he said, pointing out among the floating ice. "I barely made it to shore."
"We see the sail sinking," said the chieftain. "Guards, search the shore. You come from west over sea, from Rasiel."
He mangled the name.
"Alone?"
Elof was thinking rapidly. Of the two Ekwesh who had first crept out upon him, one was dead, one still unconscious. The others could not have seen Rock. Two were looking down the cliff, but that was evidently for signs of the man who had fallen. "My crew was drowned, I think. I called in case they had come ashore, but—" He shook his head resignedly. It was a long swim. It would have been, for a man. The chieftain eyed him a moment.
"Other gods will find them, if living. We go."
He turned to his men and clapped his hands.
"Oya kia ma."
With no more than the one command, the patrol formed ranks around Elof, two of them carrying their unconscious comrade, and strode off down the promontory. Winding in and out of the thorny bushes that had concealed them. They glanced about them as they went, stabbed a spear at likely-looking concealment, but made no serious attempt to search. Elof wondered about the other guards. At least they were not here yet. Rock would have time to take cover. But who were those others with him that he had not seen? It seemed that even if the Ekwesh were masters of this dour land, they might not be unchallenged. And Rock was free. There might not be much he could do unaided against 11 armed men. But with aid, that was something. Definitely something. All the rest of that afternoon they marched, more or less southward, along an unchanging coastline within sight of the ice-strewn sea, and into the long summer evening that followed, until no slightest trace of light remained to show their way. They halted then, and Elof, muscles weakened and gait unsteady after long weeks in the little cutter, fell groaning to the ground, clutching cramping muscles in calf and foot, but glad he had held out till the end, though it would have been little use his asking these grim folk for any rest. And yet he had already noticed many things unusual about them. For one, their armor of stiffened black leather was much thicker and heavier than the usual Ekwesh pattern, and the chieftain wore a short shirt of scale mail beneath his cloak. The clan emblem on their gear was reduced to a stylized image sketched in with a few flowing lines, and they wore fewer jangling ornaments of metal, precious or otherwise. Only the chief had gold rings in his long ears, and bronze and gold tips to the braids of his coarse black hair. He himself was unusual, like none of their chieftains Elof had met before now. Neither a malevolent old man, nor a steely young fanatic. This was a heavy man of late middle years, stone calm, granite hard, and grim of aspect. Yet neither he nor his men indulged themselves in the casual brutality of most Equesh toward their captives. They neither beat nor bound Elof as they marched, and that itself was unusual. Yet in some ways it made them more alarming. Their eyes were never far from him, and he guessed that if he had shown any tendency to slacken or sought escape, he would have suffered both. But not necessarily as retribution, more as a coolly considered means to an end. They built a great fire of brushwood that night, too great for anyone with anything much to hide or fear, and cooked over griddles among the ashes. Elof, seated in the smoky lee between two brawny spearmen, was wondering how long the food in his pack would last, when one of them passed him a deep wooden bowl of some boiled grain, a slice of bread, and a chunk of smoked meat. Elof took the bowl and bread hungrily, but when he refused the meat, it was thrust at him.
"Eat,"
barked the soldier, in an accent worse than the chieftain's.
"Is long road at first sun."
"Be damned if I will!" exploded Elof, forgetting all restraint in his loathing. "What carrion is it? Flesh of some helpless thrall?" The blow spun him round and stretched him flat on his back, blood trickling from his mouth across his burning cheek.
"That word you swallow, or I strike it in your teeth, shaman of filth."
It was the chieftain who stood over him, almost slavering with rage. He had evidently sprung straight across the fire.
"We are the proud ones. We eat no man's meat, us."
Elof heaved himself up on one elbow and glared at him. He should not have been so rash, but having spoken, to show any weakening now might be dangerous. "So?" he said, as sarcastically as his swelling lips would allow. "What do your shamans have to say about that, proud one? End the hidden clan." As he expected, that rocked the chieftain back on his heels. The spearmen sprang up and back, weapons ready.
"What might you know of Tlasuka, shaman of West Ovasi?"
He spoke very softly, fingers flexing near the short sword at his belt.
"You are of their pale masters, maybe."
Elof fought to keep up his arrogant front. "I am not. I have met them, though, men and non-men. And though they claim the ice runs in their veins and their guts, I know that for a lie. I have spilled enough of both." He was appalled at the howl his words raised, till he realized it was laughter. Even the chief was staggering around, clutching his sides. Evidently, he reflected a little queasily, he had achieved some degree of Equesh wit.
"How many?"
gasped the chief, when he could speak properly.
5 score?
More laughter, and Elof understood. Wit for them lay in outrageous boasting. The more outrageous, the better. 501, he snapped, straight-faced, to new howls. But that one I only pinked in the shoulder, and she fled me. Silence chopped down like a blade. He had said something too much, but his blood was up, and he would not now back down. If it's proof you're after, then do you only give me back my sword. Abruptly, the chief straightened up, wiping his eyes irritably.
"Oh no, word shaman," he said. "You are captive. You stay. Not free to chase Halayu."
That word Elof understood only too well. It meant Deathbringer, and also fame or honor.
"But know this of us. No ice runs in our veins. Ancestor laws, ancestors' duties we hold still, from days when clan first made compact with clan to conquer."
And those duties, do they include playing thrall to the ice? Blazed Elof. The chief would not be baited into losing his temper and his face a second time. He met Elof's gaze with contemptuous stolidity.
"No bonds bind us, save sworn word and honor. Our chiefs are no thralls to shamans, and we take no flesh of men. That is forbidden. We are the proud ones, the Kok Yuen, the Raven clan."
Raven? Elof stared at the chieftain, unable to credit what he heard, or its import. Surely it meant nothing. All the Ekwesh clans were named for the totem animals familiar to the peaceful hunter-gatherers they had once been. Yet long ago, when Kermorven had first told him who Raven truly was, he had added that many among the Ekwesh also revered him. In which case, I too have heeded a raven's cry, he said softly. He is the banner and sign of my land. Can it be the same? Heads turned in surprise, but the chieftain only grunted.
"That raven is totem to some among you, I had heard. Let us see who he favors."
Elof smiled quite quietly. He has favored me. As he expected, those words from a prisoner provoked a great wave of savage, scornful laughter. He let it subside, and when he spoke again, even he was startled by the ringing pride in his words. He has favored me, I say, my land and my king. To my poor door in such a wasteland as this he came, ere I knew who he was. A tall rider in black mail upon a mighty war horse. One or two warriors interrupted with crows of disbelief, but their voices faltered when they found themselves alone, and faded to silence when Elof's gaze fell on them. The chieftain and the others listened in silence, unstirring save for the firelight that leaped in their eyes. He gave me aid I did not know I needed. Aid that helped me to undo a great evil, that in the end raised me from the least of smiths to among the great of my land. More than once he has come, sometimes in other guise, always with aid and counsel.
"What guise?"
The chieftain's voice was soft, but his demand cracked like a whip. An old man, bearded and mantled, leaning on a staff. An old wanderer. Elof sighed. A black gloom overwhelmed him, reaction to his moment of pride. But last, in his warrior guise, wiser I had heeded him then, and never come here.
"Wiser,"
agreed the chieftain somberly, and gazed at him a while before he said more.
"Shaman, you burn from within, and the flame is clear. I do not think you lie. We too know Raven in these shapes, warrior and wise shaman, though no man living sees him so." we follow his path, straight path of the warrior, no matter the price. Though lies whispered, though trust denied, though they set us to rot on land, to guard outlands bare of blood, or fame, or booty, though they trust us with no honorable station at sea, yet we proud ones serve as sworn to by our ancestors.
The chieftain's face was an implacable copper mask, his voice pitiless as winter wind.
From word and duty we do not turn. To Iltasia take all strangers, is said. To Iltasia you must go. Does Raven come to you now? I think not.
He rose and returned to his chieftain's place on the more comfortable side of the fire.
Eat and sleep. You tread a long road, come dawn.
It proved so indeed. The Ekwesh treated their captive with greater regard, and even something like awe, but they drove him as hard as ever through all the daylight hours. It was a lonely road, too, for few had language or inclination to talk to him, and what he understood of their speech told chiefly of strife and bloodshed. Only the chieftain came to quiz him now and again, on why he had come and what he sought. Most often Elof also said nothing, or adamantly changed the subject, because he knew the Ekwesh took a direct rebuttal or denial as an insult, and to insult rather than challenge these fierce folk could be a deadly error. A straight path they might walk, but they were a warrior race nonetheless. Their orders to bring in soldiers alive would not stop them shedding his blood in some less than fatal fashion. He took his cue from the chieftain, matching his studied calm and his frank speech, and found it well received. It could not be said that any liking arose between them, so alien were they to each other. But a degree of understanding came, the more so as they sought to practice each other's tongue. Each spoke more freely to the other than they might to any who shared their concerns. The chieftain was a bitter man in his way, on behalf of his folk as well as himself. For generations now they had striven to serve both the expanding realms of the Ekwesh and their own notions of what was upright and fitting, and inevitably they had suffered for it. Their code was fierce and pitiless, but it had within it some concept of order greater than continual and bloody conquest, of duty to weaker peoples greater than mere enslavement and exploitation, of holding and building on gains. Such an attitude had made them influential in the uniting of the scattered, quarrelsome tribes, and the rise of something like a coherent realm. But beyond that realm, it also made them poor agents of the ice, whose interest lay in bringing havoc and disorder, in scorning the very name of Raven, and teaching its initiates likewise. As its influence had grown among the Ekwesh, so the prestige of the Raven clan had fallen, their more purposeful ferocity branding them cowards, their careful consolidation of conquests earning them the name of faint-hearts and laggards. Elof understood now that his bid to overawe this little group, though it had won him better treatment, had had no real chance of success. The Ravens were determined to reinstate themselves with a show of zeal and loyalty, and he was a prime opportunity. Even had they wanted to let him go, they would not have dared. When that grueling day's march came to an end, Elof again fell down in agony. He guessed, as he lay curled on the ground, that they had covered some 10 leagues of rough going, over hill and heathland, roadless save for the occasional beast track. Only once, in a marshy place, had he thought he detected a fragment of an ancient roadbed buried far beneath the mud. But on the next day's march, begun as early and as swiftly, he began to see the small heaps and circles of rough-hewn stone that he knew were the remains of simple buildings. Cot and sheepfold, perhaps. Beneath the grass and heather underfoot, he heard the rasp of laid stones. Once, this had been inhabited land. And ere long, he came upon clearer remains. Many of those ruins, with the weathered walls and gable ends bare of any roof that Nordney folk had come to call Eckwesh footprints, the marks they left upon a countryside. Yet these looked ancient, far older than the Eckwesh incursions into Nordney. How long had they held this land? Or who had held it before them? And how? How could they have reached it? Elof restrained his impatience. The chieftain might be persuaded to tell him something, but he was some distance away, striding ahead of the others as if he too were impatient. It would have to wait till they halted at nightfall. But there was no halt, for as the sun sank down towards the clouds in the distant west, setting the ice islands a glitter on the sea, the chief, reaching the top of a low slope, cried out triumphantly to his men. Elof understood, and he felt a host of new fears. They had reached their destination, with all that it held for him. What new menace must he face? Yet such was the majesty of the sight awaiting him that it drove all lesser concerns from his mind. At first, he hardly took it in. He saw only a wide bay of the sea, awash with floating ice, and behind it an encircling arm of 3 smallish mountains, low and craggy, joined by a thin-topped ridge. Its stark flanks sloped precipitously down to a strip of flat brown land at the water's edge. Then a long ray of the low sun escaped the clouds and rested a moment upon the lower central peak, tinging it with warm fire, and Elof saw that it was no work of nature. A high castle crowned the ridge, and he thought it the mightiest work that he had ever seen. In that, he was right, for no mightier than existed in the world, save only the citadels of the ice itself. This was its fashion, as it became gradually clear to Elof while he and his captors traversed the remaining half-league from the hills. From the base of the ridge, 2 vast square towers of the same sand-hued stone arose. Their flat-roofed capitals reached 3/4 of the way to its crest. Between them was a wide wall, bridged at its top by a great gallery between the towers, lined with many columns, graceful and fluted. Below this opened many lesser galleries, but the lower half of the wall was featureless save for a single arch at its center. Vast this must have been, taller at its keystone than the masts of great ships, but against the height of that wall it seemed small, no more than a gate. And seen above the height of that first immense wall reared another, after the same pattern, a gallery between 2 towers. But this was lower and narrower, and the overhanging pediments of the towers were level with the ridge. At each corner stood a statue, and between the statues, a traceried rail of carven stone. But above these vastnesses loomed a third level still, rounding like the base of an unseen column that upheld the sky, like a crown fit for the brows of powers in their majesty. A high palace it was, in itself greater than the citadel of Kerbrahine or the palace of Morvenhall that was his home. Windows and galleries latticed its walls, statues encircled its roof. Its every line spoke nobility and power, chiefly power. This was a place made to daunt, and daunt it did. With the sun's fire upon its walls, it seemed rich and noble, fit for the court of the living powers. But the sun was slipping behind the clouds, and as Elof was shepherded ever nearer, the air turned murky and cold, and the fire fled. A low mountain it seemed once more as the shadow wrapped itself around, and few lights showed upon those towering walls. It was at the foot of the ridge that lights shone out, the bleak land flickering under the flares of a myriad torches, warmed with the kindling of numberless fires, as if beneath the castle a sprawling town had sprung up, almost a city by its extent, huddled at its feet like hound to master. It was towards this lake of lights that Elof's captors led him. The sound of harsh voices reached him from afar, of flutes and drumming, and he guessed that this must be some huge encampment of the Eqwesh. It proved to be that, and more, however, for instead of tent and shelter, there were many boat-shaped longhouses of rough, tarry planking set within sturdy compound fences, above whose gates hung sign and symbol of the clans. Curiosity overcame fear in him, for he had never before seen a full Eqwesh community. Also, a sense of regret and anger, for the houses with their flanks of pattern-painted clapboard were very like those of his own village, that the Eqwesh themselves had devastated. It was their own cousins, their own flesh they had been induced to scorn and betray, and the gap between even modest civilization and savagery was all too apparent. Livestock wandered free and untended between the houses, and there seemed to be little or no attempt at drainage. They walked on boards among filth, and the stench of the place was terrible. Life in all its aspects seemed to be carried on in the open air, amid howl, hubbub, and the beat of drums from the open spaces between the compounds. As they passed one of these, Elof saw a shaman dancing some rite with warriors. He was an eerie figure, clad only in a long skirt of leather strips, his scrawny body painted in many colors with the emblem of the Mosquito clan, and his white hair flying as he whirled about among the warriors, hurling a much shorter figure from one to another. It was a girl, wearing only some rags about her thighs. Ochre plastered her cropped hair flat, but her skin gleamed a much lighter brown than the rest. That would make her half-bred, and therefore by definition a thrall here. He wondered what her fate would be, and then remembered with a sudden jolt that in even more immediate question was his own. They wound away through the outskirts of the encampment, down ways of mire and slime, often having to leap aside to avoid horsemen who came cantering through, and once a column of thralls being driven like ponies at the run. The compound they finally entered was broad, but few fires burned there. The door before which the chieftain paused and called was wide, but the light within dim and smoky. Swift words were exchanged, and Elof was thrust forward into the gloom. His smarting eyes could barely pick out a double row of figures seated around a trench of fire, many white-haired and bent. Words flew again, and a burst of harsh laughter. Then he was seized by the arms and bundled outside once again, with the chieftain by his side, his face a grimace of satisfaction.
So,
he said, savoring the words,
a great prize you are, and one awaited. You bring us fortune, West Shaman. Come, we go to Iltasia.
He pointed up into the darkness where the heights of the castle were hidden. They passed out of the Ekwesh town then, and up the slopes of the ridge to the side of the nearer tower. It was an easy enough climb, for there were steps sunk in the stone, ancient and dished with weather and wear, but well-formed and serviceable. The air blew strangely chill from below. Looking down, Elof saw beyond the town a harbor of many ships, large and small, behind a strong seawall. And that was needed, for the whole bay was speckled with ice islands in various stages of decay, as if some freak of the currents drew them in here in their last melting. He shivered, and was glad when they passed through a narrow wicket into the blackness of the tower. Torches blossomed, flickering in the airflow, and their light fell upon a narrow flight of stone steps, steep and cramped between high walls. Elof swallowed, remembering how tall that tower had seemed from without. But hard hands at his back thrust him forward. In single file they climbed into an echoing vault of shadow, lit blue-gray only by faint spills of moonlight through the narrow window slits. The right-hand wall dropped away into emptiness. They were mounting the inner wall of the tower, by stairs that ringed its hollow heart. As his eyes grew accustomed to the dimness, he saw that it was not wholly empty, that heart. A curious engine of cables and pulleys hung there, extending both above and below in the tall well. It seemed to him like some enormous lifting hoist, able to raise great weight of goods or men. That this place should have such a thing made sense, and it looked in reasonable repair. But in that case, why did the Ekwesh not use it? However hardy they were, in time alone, it offered advantages over this endless climb, this overpowering darkness. Because they couldn't? It was more than likely. This place was nothing of theirs. Here all voices were hushed in awe. The least word spoken went fluttering away into the cavernous dark above, and after a while no man spoke, but concentrated on the exhausting climb. The only sounds were those of rasping breath echoing around the enclosed walls, and the monotonous thud of heavy sandaled feet upon the steps. It seemed to merge, that constant rhythm, with the leaden passing of the hours, until he forgot that he was walking, that the distant ache was his weary limbs. Space and time were one, and he was floating upwards, ascending out of the past that lay below into the future above, and all was as shadows, dim and indistinct in that strange undersea light. Somewhere above, many deep bells were tolling. Suddenly, it was as if the world had turned on its side, the great space above opening out instead before him. Dreamily he looked up, and saw revealed through the blue dimness vaulting so high and wide-swept, it might have been the very roof of the sky. Gradually, as his exhausted trance faded, he realized he was climbing no longer, that he was stumbling along the smooth and level floor of a majestic hallway towards a high-arched door where points of fire burned, gleaming red, on the metal of armed sentinels. Weapons were leveled. A harsh challenge raised the echoes, was answered as harshly. He caught no more than the name Iltasia once again. Other sentinels appeared from within the gate, and herded in the raven clansmen much as they herded him, into an even darker quarter behind. The roof was hidden, but from the echoes it sounded less high. A screech and a crash made him start. An upheld torch shone fire upon a heavy door, thrown back to reveal a small chamber, its walls of dusty stone, windowless. The sentinel seized his arms and flung him down on the flagstones. Darkness slammed shut about him. He almost welcomed it in his exhaustion. So restful it seemed. It felt impossibly good simply to lie still and silent, no matter how hard his bed. He was half aware that he no longer had his pack, but he was too wary to feel any concern. His eyelids fluttered, his head sank down. He struggled to stave off sleep, to guess where he might be and what might happen next. But what was the point? He could do nothing about it. As well be rested when it came. Thunder and light jerked him awake, his eyes sticky, his limbs stiff and aching as he was hauled bodily to his feet and shoved stumbling into the corridor. It was still gloomy, and he guessed he had slept at most for an hour. Ekwesh guards with swords and spears surrounded him, and it disturbed him that none of them bore raven crests, and many only a meaningless pattern of white bars. He had seen too many like them in Morvenhall, acknowledged members of the hidden clan. Yet though they prodded him along roughly enough, hauling him round corner after corner and up long, echoing flights of stairs, they were never brutal. In fact, they seemed to be taking elaborate, if cold-blooded, care of him, as might one charged with carriage of some precious thing. Yet the brutality lurked there in their blank, dark eyes. Acknowledged or not, they were all of the hidden clan, if any were. In the shadows above the stairs, a tall double door was seamed in yellow light. It opened, and the flood was dazzling. Into the midst of it he was thrust, blinded and squinting foolishly. He reached out to steady himself, and closed his hand on what was unmistakably worked velvet, heavy and costly. A heavy, aromatic scent filled the air, and a welcome warmth crept up through his boots. One of the Ekwesh pushed past him and spoke. His harsh tones sunk almost to a breathless, awed whisper. Elof heard no reply, but he was pushed forward at once, and his jacket was pulled from his back. His tattered clothes and boots, stiffened with filth and salt, ripped off him. He started to struggle, but as his sight cleared of its swirling colors, he was astonished to find himself tottering on the glossed stone steps of a wide bath, filled almost to floor level with steaming water. He stared at it unbelieving. A bath was what his whole frame ached for, and he could almost believe this was some tantalizing torture. Before he could hesitate any longer, however, the grim-faced guards seized him and hurled him bodily into the water. The heat and the impact of it struck his breath away, and he rose gasping and spluttering, eyes smarting with pungent oils. But water-filled ears heard only the receding ring and slap of sandals on the stone. He turned and saw the doors close smoothly on their heels. All his guards had gone. That alone made a great difference, and though he was still confused and apprehensive, he felt himself succumbing to the water's grateful warmth. Whatever was to come, he reflected, he could face it better rested and relaxed. It could hardly put him in any worse case than he was already. With a deep groan, he sagged back into the water, wincing as it bit at his scrapes and bruises, and blinked his eyes clear. He could hardly believe them. Only once before had he seen rooms so richly furnished, the old royal chambers of Morven. But they had been dusty and ill lit, and Kermorven had them cleared to suit his own more austere tastes. Here, the floor was of polished stone, black as onyx, the walls smooth white, but overhung with velvet in rich blue hues of night, worked about with gold and silver. If there were any windows, they were hidden. At each corner the bath was lit by lamps on ornate stands, blazing with scented oil. And though he saw no fire, the stone at the bath rim was warm to the touch. Many ewers of lye oil and balm stood there, mingling their fragrance with the heavy air. In an idle humor he reached out to one, but as he touched it, it rattled and rocked on its base. So sharp and sudden was the tremor in his hands. The tall, fair woman who sat in the shadows of the hangings rose from her chair, stooped swiftly, and caught the ewer before it could overset. "Have a care, young smith. This is rare and precious stuff you trifle with here. Lean forward. Bow your head." Elof, slack-jawed, could not bring himself to move, let alone obey. For he could conceive of nothing save his own immediate and helpless death. Had he been clad and afoot, he would have been casting about for some weapon, some way of escape. But now an absurd and paralyzing vulnerability held him in thrall. The tall woman snorted with impatience, pushed his head down on his chest, and poured a measured flow of the stuff in the ewer over his head and shoulders, and into the waters beyond. It gave off a strange scent, dark and slightly bitter, and tingled on his skin. But where it flowed, the worst of his pains seemed to dissolve away, and he subsided into the water once again, utterly at a loss. "Louhi," he said, or meant to say. It emerged as a ghastly croak. The woman smiled in wry acknowledgment. "Even so. The ice lies all about the earth, north and south, west and east. Why should you not expect to find me here?" She set the ewer down and stepped hastily back to her former place. "Enjoy your bath, young smith. Make yourself as clean as you would wish to be. Doubtless, you will be more at ease so, and I also. No offense, but you have come through great hardships of late that cannot but have left their marks upon you, and I suffer from too keen an awareness of such things. Of senses other than smell also," she added with rueful grace, "not being born to them. I lack a lifetime's practice in ignoring their importunate messages, such as you mortals enjoy. To me they come new-minted, undulled, each time I take on form, and they are a continual torment." "A wonder you can endure the Eqwesh, then," Elof grunted, his head still a-whirl. Louhi shrugged her shapely shoulders in answer. "I cannot, save with difficulty. I deal with them through more civilized minions, or from a distance. You may have heard what they call me, Iltasia, the Old One Unseen. But they are apt to the hand, and they are brave, as are you, young smith. All across the seas of the sunrise you have sailed to their eastern shores, and all in vain." Elof tensed, but remained lying where he was. "Who says so, lady? Yourself? But you cannot be sure of my purpose, can you?" Louhi, her face grave and impassive, almost sad, turned to a low table beside her, of black marble, white-veined, and took up from it something that caught and enhanced the gold of the lamplight, mellow and fair. Elof's heart gave a terrible leap. It was his half of the broken arm ring. They had given her his pack. She came forward again, gathering up her white robe to kneel by the bath side. To his astonishment, she held out the half ring and put it into his hand. But then she reached up to her throat and drew up a thin golden chain that hung there, and from her breast lifted another such twist of gold upon its end. And that, too, she put into his limp fingers ere he could speak. He looked from it to her, feeling its warmth contrast with the coolness of his half, then seized the pieces and thrust them together, telling himself frantically that it was a trick, a copy, that such a thing might easily be confected in a few hours, were the jeweler skilled enough. But it was not. They fitted, and not only in physical form. Elof knew the unity of his own work, none better, and his fingers could sense the sudden reviving flow of forces within the metal as it touched. His eyes saw the tremulous gleams that shot this way and that like small fish in a pond. Independent of the lamplight. This was in truth the first gift to his love, and his last, the making of it and the breaking. He glared up at the pale-haired woman, silently daring her to gloat, or even smile, so that he could dash it from her face. "You took this from her?" he grated. "Where have you caged her? You wolf's bitch! Where is she?" But Louhi's face remained calm. "She gave me it," was her quiet reply, "without benefit of cage or any such barbarity." Gently she slipped the pieces from Elof's nerveless grasp, and, ignoring his belated grab, replaced them on the table. "You see," she said, without a trace of a gloat, "I have what I have long sought, and I fear you need not think to take it from me ever again." It came to Elof's mind then, what part of it could still think, that Louhi had ordered her ground for this encounter with great subtlety. None among his folk, save the upper orders, were especially squeamish about nakedness. No other could afford to be. And he was no highborn, yet he found himself fettered by his situation, fettered and oppressed. Before those cool blue eyes he was as uncertain as a child, unwilling to leave the sheltering water, yet within it vulnerable and at a loss, too easily dominated. He saw it clearly, yet he was powerless to change it. For those quiet, unforgivable words, he might have sought to attack Louhi with his own two hands, to stifle the life of her body, or even to try to hold her hostage before her followers. But thus naked and enmeshed, he could hardly summon up the spirit. He could not possibly hoist himself from this deep bath swiftly enough. He would look ridiculous. He would probably slip on that glassy floor and split his skull anyway. What good would it do? What did it truly matter? It or anything? He had no trouble believing Louhi's words. In her very mildness, he could read the truth. Kara, in her fury and her sorrow, had obeyed that nagging call and fled back from the company of men to the security of her bonds, the shelter of her own kind. He could hardly blame her. A deep misery, deep as the roots of the world, came pressing in upon his mind, and depression like a rolling wall of mist, distancing and darkening the very hues of life. It clung to him too closely for the release of fury or of sorrow. He had done with caring. He laid his head back wearily against the lowest step and closed his eyes. He jumped when Louhi spoke again, for it had seemed there was no more she need say. Also, she was again close by, kneeling and looking down at him with the same grieved mien. "I find it in me to pity you, young smith." Elof flinched in angry disgust, but she held up a restraining hand. "No, I speak no hypocrisies, truly. What need have I to? What I said, I meant. Have I not felt as you feel now, and at your hands? Believe me, I would not mock it. I know. But do not despair too soon. I said that you need not hope to take her from me, and that I meant also. But it is possible that I might relinquish her. Relinquish her? Elof felt more adrift than ever. So, oh, not wholly, not forever. Would you, had you the choice, for a time, a span, the span of a mortal life? Her full lips pressed tight till the color drained from them. That is not easily offered, or lightly. Even to think of it is, oh, pain, revulsion. Look into yourself and understand. Yet I have had to see her pass from me once already, and to me one life would be a short enough time to bear, though that life might be made very long indeed, young smith, if you were willing to join Kara in my service. Consider, she said, almost pleading, before Elof could even gather his startled thoughts, let alone utter a word. Why not? Consider what you have seen here. Has the dominion you call the ice not one far further southward than in your own land? Most of the world is thus, Elof. A great change is coming, and it totters in the balance. Only a little further, a small advance, and the balance will tip beyond recall. She rose on her knees, staring out into infinite distance, and shook back her smooth cascade of pale blonde hair. I had hoped to make that advance in your land, young smith, thinking it easier than here. You taught me my mistake, you and yours. But here it shall still come about. The ice will not advance. Not far, young smith, not far, but far enough to reflect some small portion of the sun's heat, and so cool the climb of the world just a fraction further. And that will be enough. That, cast into the scales, will turn them. From that moment on, we no longer need strain to advance the ice. It will become a process of growth, clean growth without the taint of life. Its advance will chill the world further, and that chill will advance the ice, as a morsel of snow set tumbling down a mountain may grow, unstoppably, to a mighty avalanche. So the margins of the ice shall grow of their own moving force, to encompass and cleanse this carrion world. And the peace that is cold will settle about it, and our day shall come again. Then we shall live free indeed, free from the strife that devours us, free from all the ills, demands, indignities, free from the burning tomb that you call flesh. Slowly she subsided, leaned sideways to rest on one hand, her hair hiding her face. Elof sank down in horror, the warmth of the bath lost to him in his shock, recalling all the Duergar lore he had learned of the ice. It was all too plausible, what she had said. It could come about. But when? How soon? How long remained? She looked down at him suddenly, high breasts heaving, but serene of face as ever. But it would not happen at once, young smith. Not in one lifetime of men, or even two, though it could not be stopped. You could live on happily enough. Even your friends would be left alone to live out their lives, if they waged no war against me, for I would no longer need to assail them. And those you assail here? Demanded Elof sternly, though his words rang hollow within. She shook her head sadly. Them? You need think nothing of them. In their unceasing folly they deserve disaster. Almost they court it. They will bring down the ice upon their own heads. I cool the water about these lands, mask the drift ice at its gates, freeze the rivers that feed the land. The Equesh serve only as the living spearhead of the ice, and the haft is half a world wide, and hurled by many hands. Fair young smith, I and mine are on the verge of victory, and yet that victory will only win back what was so unjustly wrested from us long ago. We have yearned for that, yes. But is it so terrible to yearn thus, exiled and opposed? Can you find no scrap of sympathy for us? No understanding? Have not you done the same in all your wanderings? And along the way, from haste or need or plain folly, we have done some terrible things. And have not you also? But we will have what we yearn for, and perhaps You shall also. If you would give me what I yearn for, said Elof dully, you would slay me here and now. It would be a kindness, perhaps. She gazed back at him and shook her head. Once I might have, but Smith, I have warmed to you. You are brave, and you harbor a force of your own, mortal though you be. That is rare among the herd of common men in any age. And I have learned much about you, I, from Kara. You have awoken a power to love, young man, and that is no small thing. Our kind knows love indeed, but of a different nature. It is not the same as this mortal huddling, this passion that spurs on the lowest, laughable urges, the mingling of flesh in filth. It is no desperate snatching at happiness made more precious by its own mortality, by its own inevitable end. It is no fire doomed to blaze and burn out, no flake of snow to melt even as it is grasped. For the force of the lower love to touch the higher, that is rare, and not to be lightly thrown aside. I say again, Elof, I would have you at my side. She rose, tall and beautiful as a crest of sun-bright cloud, and turned back to the table, began sifting through the things that lay there. You are a smith of surpassing craft, like none I have encountered in this age. That helm, I have marveled at its power, but I do not see it here. Lost in your wreck? A terrible loss, but you may live to shape another. And this gauntlet, from among the Duergar, perhaps, but no other men, and the same for this hammer. And these are surely the fatal anklets. I find it hard to blame you, young smith, truly I do. You have my sympathy, even if I have none of yours. And this sword that you call Gorthar. She drew it with a hiss and a flourish, but in her hands the black blade was silent. She gave a bitter laugh. This at least I have felt from you. She balanced it in her hand a moment. Then suddenly she sprang forward in a fierce lunge, and sent it stabbing and cutting through the air in graceful exercises of formal sword-play that bent her lissom body like a bow, drawing her robe tight about her and loosening it at breast and flank. Elof watched her in fascination as he danced back and forth about the bath, cleaving the columns of steam into swirling panic, till at last she paused with a peal of silvery laughter and stood panting, her straight hair clinging in disheveled wisps about her damp face, her cheeks and breast flushed bright with unaccustomed color. This, at least, she repeated, her blue gaze bright and intense. And small wonder, it is a magnificent blade, a noble weapon. She stooped beside him like a plunging bird. Here you wounded me in the shoulder. Do you think I would hate you for that? But I at least can forget wounds when they have healed. She reached out suddenly, and her long, strong fingers closed on his. Their warmth was startling. She lifted his hand unresisting to her shoulder, and with it drew down the loosened shoulder of her robe. See, not a scar remains. It was true. Where Gorthar had struck, the skin was milky white, unmarked, unmarred, glossed with a faint sheen of perspiration. She drew his fingers over the spot, and down over the curve of her breast, the robe falling away before them. Color surged beneath the skin, and she breathed quickly through parted lips. Her blue eyes were half-hooded by their fluttering lids. Her breast jutted firm and damp into his cupped hand, and he traced the nipple with coursing fingers. Her other hand reached out, touched his neck, and quivered there an instant, then moved on to caress his neck and ear, his throat and chest. She gasped slightly, throwing back her head, and caught his hand to her. Only then did he try to snatch it away, but she was as strong as he was. Then she relaxed, slid it down across her ribs, the top plane of muscle at her waist, and down, pulling her sash away and parting her robe, down till it slid over soft curls and pressed in between her thighs. Abruptly she pulled away and rose, and stood a moment, with parted robe clinging to her damp body, fixed in his gaze, gazing at him with an intensity that blazed like the north lights. Suddenly the air was heavy with a scent, whether it rose from the water or from her. That stirred his thoughts into a blurred confusion. "Hate, if you will, Elof," she said softly, almost chanting her words. "Only hate fiercely. They are the great twins, Master Smith, the great unities. Hate and love, ice and fire. And when the force of the stars themselves is spent, when rights and wrongs alike are forgotten, and darkness claims all things, they shall lie down together and become one." Loss and misery, drowning in the beauty of her, foundering in her gaze. Then she shrugged the robe from her shoulders and peeled it away, and stood naked and fair as the vision of her true self amid rivers of falling stars. Yet fairer still than the vision she seemed, for she was present and real, though her skin shone translucent as milky ice. When she padded to the steps and down, thigh deep into the lapping water, Elof caught his breath, as if the heat might melt her away. But the hand that touched him, that coursed along his body and encircled him in its caress, was warmer even than the water, and the lips that pressed on his flared like fire, traced burning trails of it along him as he floated, catching flame in his turn. The arms he closed about her encircled glowing heat. His fierce caress unleashed its flows, and as she pressed closer to him, flung thigh across him and drew him close, he remembered what he had once been told, that deep within the ice the fires of the earth might still burn, a furnace contained that would burst out with searing force. They closed, and within the furnace she drew him, and as one they burned. After a time, when the seething waters grew still, she led him by the hand from the bath, and across the room to the alcove where she had sat, and drew back the heavy hangings there to reveal a carven door. It opened onto suffocating luxury, a wide galleried bedchamber hung all around in gold and saffron yellow, save where a tall, narrow window gleamed upon blackness. Against the far wall was set a great bed of silken cushions and counterpanes. Upon a side table stood a pitcher and goblets. She poured him a glass of thick yellow wine, honey-scented and strong, and slipped back into the bath chamber a moment ere came to join him. Together, sipping their wine, they walked hand in hand to the bed, and there as she lay down he poured a trickle of wine across her breasts and kissed it away. Among the cushions, as time passed, they twined and thrashed and sweated to their shuddering conclusions, each contesting the other's limits, till they fell at last to the dalliance of exhaustion, and from that sighed down and twined into sleep. After some time Elof shifted, as the heaviest sleepers may, but his hand fell idly free. Some time later, as he stretched comfortably, his legs slid gently from under the others, but he made no move, and his breathing soon grew still. It might have been a half an hour before he moved again, and that, slowly, flexing the hand she had trapped between her thighs, gently, insistently, till she herself shifted and flexed. Then, though he might have slipped away, he lay still beside her, listening intently to her breathing. Another quarter hour or so he lay still before beginning to inch his way over the cushions and onto the thick carpeting below. Once there, he did not get up, but moved on all fours, reflecting wryly that he would have distrusted his legs anyway, so tremulous they felt. The door opened as silently as he had hoped, but only when it was shut behind him did he pull himself to his unsteady feet by the frame and draw a deep, shuddering breath. Relief and revulsion surged through him with such force he almost vomited. And they were made all the worse by the inescapable memory of how he had responded to her. His clothes lay where they had been torn from him. He gathered them up and forced himself into them, binding them about him as best as he could, shuddering. They were half soaked with slops from the agitated bath, and none the better for it. Then, gathering his wits, he padded swiftly over to the small table. She had extinguished all but one light, and it lay in deep shadow. He reached out gingerly, and touched only bare marble. Panic shook him, but he forced it down. She had been gone only a moment, so unless some servant had removed them. He began to twitch the hangings aside, and behind the one directly opposite he encountered a plain blank door with the look of an ombre about it. But it was locked, and he could find neither the key nor the means to make a pick. In desperation, he plucked loose the heavy belt that had borne Gorthar, forced the strong buckle between the door and frame, and began to pry them apart, leaning on the hangings to muffle the creaking and snapping of wood, forcing his fingers in between. In seconds he had a gap through which he could thrust his hand. He managed to grasp the crumpled hide of his pack. Drawing it out through the narrow gap was less easy, but fear drove him. He did it, and when he rummaged through his possessions, he clutched it to his heart in deep relief. As he had hoped, Louhi, in her haste, had simply scooped all the smaller items into it. Gauntlet, anklets, they were there, and even the two halves of the arm ring, one still on its chain. That left Gorthar and his hammer. By dint of much straining he had the sword, and with it he could just touch the haft. If he could only hook it towards him, if the gap were that fraction wider. He forced his broad arm into the gap, feeling the wood quiver, thrust further, and fell sprawling among the hangings as, with a crack like a blow in the face, the whole door snapped across and swayed from its hinges. He struggled free, and still on his knees, tore the sagging door aside. The hammer spilled from a dislodged shelf onto the floor, but even as he snatched at it, the inner door crashed back, and Louhi stood there before him. "So," she said, and the very sound of her voice, controlled and calm as it was, chilled him rigid. Still unclad, still fair, but no less a sight of terror, her blue eyes glinting like the sunken ice, her lips drawn dead white and snarling. A beast returning to his vomit. A sacred trust is shattered for this. For this, deathless Taunatar abases herself. She opens the treasures of this body, her temple, to an animal, accepts the degradation, undergoes the pollution, the foulness. Loathing contorted her like a serpent. Her voice sank into hissing incoherence, and a ribbon of saliva ran unregarded from one corner of her working lips. Elof shrank back, afraid as he had seldom been of anything. For a moment she seemed wholly unhuman. A moving window onto a landscape bleaker even than the material ice, yet alive with a hidden wrath. She looked ready to spring at his throat. Before his eyes, his own hair bristling, he saw hers, palest silken blonde, rise straight up into the white mane of a fiend. Against that tide of inhuman fury, the blade in his hand seemed an irrelevance. Flight filled his mind to the exclusion of all else. A frantic, feral panic. But he could not forget the hammer, and made one wild grab. Louhi, though she was out of reach, stooped even more swiftly, and touched her fingers to the wet floor. It was as if a window were thrown open into a winter storm. With a shock that hurt Elof's panting lungs, all the warmth was blasted from the air, and in the blink of an eye, a white film raced like ground glass over hanging and tapestry around the alcove. Over the marble, the water from their bath and their bodies crackled to solid ice. The hammer did not move. It was frozen solid to the floor. Elof cried out at the agony in his knees as the ice enmeshed them, and barely in time tore free and fell aside, clutching the wall. The floor was drier there, and the ice did not follow. But Louhi clenched the steam-sodden hangings, and they stiffened to stinging glass above him. On all fours he scrambled back, feeling the sodden clamminess of his clothes, knowing she had only to touch him, and he would suddenly be encased in a cast of burning ice. Enough, perhaps, to freeze his blood or stop his heart by the shock alone. Now he saw that she had chosen her ground even more carefully than he had guessed, and how subtly she had put him at her mercy. That bath had made him vulnerable in body as well as mind. She paced forward now with the measured pad of a snow tiger, and he could not even rise properly, his feet slipping on black ice beneath him as he scrabbled towards the door. Suddenly she cried out, a piercing summons, and from outside came the rattle of feet and harsh cries in answer. The door quivered under a blow and flew open, and the gap filled with Eqwesh guards. Against them, Elof could lift his sword, but knew it was of no use. There were too many, and some had bows. He moved slowly back, scanning the room for some advantage, and they made no move, content to bar his way for their mistress. Now the wall was at his back, and all avenues of escape blocked. All? Something jutted against his hunched shoulder. That must be, had to be, the edge of a window arch. But a window to where? Opening upon what? It hardly mattered when swift death was the alternative. He seized the chill hangings, bunching his fists in them, and with reckless strength he hurled himself against what lay behind. He had a brief glimpse of narrow-netted leaded panes that gleamed with 100 jeweled hues. Before his shoulders, shielded by the rime-stiffed velvet, crashed against them and through. Over the frame he rolled and out, clinging to the hangings as he kicked about, feeling them begin to give under his weight. Edged stone scraped against his leg, and he looked down to find a foothold. Emptiness roared beneath him, the very shock of it like thunder in his ears. Like a blow, it dashed his breath out of his breast, strangled a cry in his throat. A fly unwebbed, he dangled and kicked upon the outermost walls of that fortress mountain, and beneath him the abyss gaped and growled, its depths a dizzying, smoky blur as he spun. The sudden sweat on his palms stung against the ice-caked cloth, and he slipped down a span, caught himself with a jerk, and felt the rending in the material. Swallowing hard, he kicked out to reach the ledge he had felt, and found it, barely wider than his boot. He braced his leg against it to stop him swinging and reached up desperately with his sword hand for some hold above. All he found was a narrow lip of masonry, barely wide enough for his fingers to clutch, no more. With the care of desperation, he caught at it and pulled himself up, gasping against the cold stone. The hangings billowed suddenly and collapsed, falling past him into nothingness. He clung to the stone lest they pull him loose. Some hand above had severed them, only just too late. He could only have been dangling there for the space of a heartbeat, though it had seemed like hours. He looked up and found himself below a lip of masonry. He could neither see the window nor be seen from it. Must be deep in a recess, as proof against weather, perhaps. But he could hear guttural shouts and guessed that they knew he had not fallen. At any rate, they would hardly take it on trust. They had only to throw something down on him. Water, even. He struggled to repress the sweat that made his fingers slippery, and began to inch his way along the ledge and out from directly underneath the window, sliding foot and fingers along a careful turn. Gorthar seemed to weigh tons in his fingers, yet he dared not try to thrust it through his belt, lest it trip or dislodge him. After a few minutes he rested it by its hilt on the ledge and pulled it along in stages, little by little, as he moved. After a few minutes his breathing steadied, and he felt able to risk a look along the ledge to see where it might lead him. To his astonishment, he found himself looking at the shadowy outlines of trees, leaden in the first gray light, upon a steep hillside no great distance away. With great care he turned his head, rolling it back so it would not force him from the wall, and saw the same. Then he understood. This was the far side of the fortress, rising not in imperious stages, but in a single sweeping wall, and much narrower. He yearned to turn and see what lay behind, but did not dare. Time enough when he was off this terrible perch. Then movement caught his eye, and he saw what must be a rope come snaking down from the window recess, and a moment later a lean figure scrambling down it, apparently barefoot, but with a sword slung across his shoulders. The Eqwesh reached the ledge and clung tight with fingers and toes. The sight of it almost unnerved Elof, so precarious did it look. It brought home to him his own plight. The moment the first man was free of the rope, another came slithering down, and after him a third. But the third, perhaps overconfident or weaker in the fingers, lost his handhold, clawed frantically for balance, and then with a scream that sickened Elof's stomach, he toppled out into emptiness. His shriek seemed to go on forever, and Elof had to steel himself not to look down after him. Another warrior came sliding down the rope, as if quite unconcerned by his fellow's fate, and joined the others. Above his head, one more appeared. Setting his teeth in his lower lip, Elof began to shuffle along, as fast as he dared. There was more effort in this controlled, cramped movement than in a mad dash, and he felt his much abused leg muscles beginning to tremble. But the sentinels were gaining, and the leader was already freeing a hand to draw the long sword from his back, the others readying their stabbing spears. Elof realized there was no way he could turn to bring his right hand to bear on them. Gorthar felt strange in his left hand, that usually bore the gauntlet, but he had no choice. He inched along with only his right hand for support. The leader came within reach, and as Elof had hoped, he swung out and cut at Elof with a great sweeping stroke. He brought Gorthar crashing down in a parry, a blow that moved outward from the wall, so that as the blades clashed, he was pressed closer against it, but the Eqwesh was driven outward by the impact. His grip slid and faltered, and he too dropped shrieking into the deep. Even as he toppled, a spear stabbed past Elof's shoulder, close against the wall. But the black sword was closer, swung up from beneath and slashed open its wielder's arm. The spear flew wide, and its wielder after it. Now Elof took the offensive, 2 shuffling steps back and a straight thrust that ducked under the next blade and took its wielder between the ribs. He cried out and dropped his spear, but clung there gasping, blocking the way for his fellows. Elof was appalled to see the next one lift his spear and callously dash the wounded man loose. But in falling, he caught the other's leg and drew them both from the wall. The warrior behind stared after them, then made the cleverest move, hurling his spear along the wall, but Gorthar struck it aside. Then, though he bore an axe at his belt, the thrower made no move to advance, nor did those behind press him. Elof, with a sudden surge of confidence, went shuffling along at what seemed like a great speed, and soon left them behind. As he had expected, other windows were flung open above, and all manner of things flung down the walls. Water, rubbish, offal, and other filth, even rich furnishings. But the throwers could only guess at their target, and their aim was poor. Nets and chains swung and swept from the crenellations above came closest to unbalancing him. But once, when a carved waterspout gave him a firm handhold, he was able to reach up and seize such a net, and by wrenching it suddenly, pull his unwary assailant right over the parapet. There were no more nets then, but also no more spouts within reach, and he began to grow very weary. He dreaded arrows from among the trees, but none came. He guessed they grew too thickly for any clear shot. But up ahead, blocking his path, was a squat tower, evidently the guard tower for this end of the wall. He could see that the ledge he stood on ran out around it, past waterspouts at each corner, but equally clearly the lip that was his handhold did not. And when he came out along that ledge, he would be briefly in clear sight from the parapet above, and in clear shot. The far side was not so bad, for so steeply sloped the hill that the treetops almost reached it. If worst came to worst, he could cast himself down among them. But that bare wall, without a handhold? He fought down the shivering, lest it lose him the hold he had. He twisted his head back, and saw light in the hazy air behind him. the serrated treetops along the hillside growing clear against it. Sunrise was upon the heights, and it would be his friend. All too soon he had reached the tower, dodging only a few half-hearted missiles, but before he essayed it, he waited a few precious moments, resting as best he could. Let them wait, and be less aware. He held up Gorthar to his weary eyes, saw mirrored in its black sheen a tiny seam of pure fire open between hill and sky. A shaft of gold struck suddenly through the haze, and another, lighting on the tower, the treetops, the wall with dazzling warmth. It was then, when night-eyed watchers must be suddenly blinded, that he made his move, reaching out to straddle the gulf beneath and pull himself across onto the tower. It was worse than before, far worse. The weight of the sword clamped between his fingers, face and chest and knees pressed flat to the rough stonework. He shuffled as fast as he dared, but knew he was far too slow. Upon the very thought, a shaft sang over his head and struck dust from the stone. He glared up and saw two archers scrambling up onto the parapet, leading out to draw, and others running to join them. And useless as it was, he lifted Gorthar in a sudden flash of defiance. Suddenly, it dulled. A shadow blotted out the sunrise, wings widespread, sweeping down its rays towards him, skimming the heads of the startled bowmen. One loosed wildly and fell back behind the parapet. The other leaned out to take new aim and fell shrieking from his perch, to crash up against the ledge and tumble down upon the treetops below. Elof, heart leaping in his breast, lifted his hand, then ducked as wings thrashed deafeningly above him and half-webbed claws raked the air. He flung up a hand, and suddenly, as swift and sudden as its coming, the great swan was gone. Only then did he realize his hand still held the sword. It was Kara, beyond any shred of doubt. But what had she meant? To help him, or to slay him? She had come close to dislodging him also. Might easily have done. And yet... Cursing, half-weeping, confused, he scrambled and staggered to the corner of the tower, only to find that the waterspout here was large enough to block his path. To free his hands, he had first to reach Gorthar over and scrambled gingerly after it. He managed it safely, finding it a great relief to see the treetops so much closer. But when he reached down for his sword, it was not there. He looked up, straight into a pair of blazing blue eyes. A window opened above that narrow ledge, and upon it, 1 foot outstretched, stood Louhi, as steadily as she might upon any floor of stone. Though the wind plucked wildly at her robe and hair, her mouth was twisted, her lip bitten to bleeding. He was astonished to see the tracks of tears upon those cheeks like milky ice. And she held the black sword in her outstretched hand. "So it ends, young smith," was all she said, ere she thrust. To few men can it have been given to feel that agony twice, but it was to him. It tore a gasping shriek from him, and he curled around it as if to hold in what was spilled, clasping the sword to him, tearing it from her grasp. Ice was everywhere, pouring into his entrails. His legs lagged beneath the weight of it, and he toppled from the ledge into open air. A sickening, suspended moment, and the world was full of whipping, crashing, the reek of pines, and sickening, numbing impacts. Then something huge hammered into his back, and there was new agony as the sword was jolted free. Dimly, he heard Louhi shouting from above, "Gather me all he bore, and then burn the carrion. But first, set his head atop the gate." Dear God, this guy writes the longest freaking chapters. All right, everyone. Well, we made it through chapter 4 to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is where we will pick up next week. I will still be here for next week's stream. The week after that, I actually am leaving on vacation, but I'm going to try. So next week we'll do chapter 5, because chapter 5 is another one that's, page 147. Yeah, about 50 pages. So it's about the same length. And then, we'll look at chapter 6. I will try to record chapter 6 to actually put up while you guys are here and I am away. That is my goal at any rate. We'll see if I'm able to make it happen before then. Other than that, thank you all for being here with me tonight. If you could do me the favor of making sure that you get out there and like the videos on my YouTube channel for these live readings, the recordings that I have done, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just helps me to continue to grow that venue. I hope you guys all have yourselves a wonderful evening. Tomorrow is Wednesday, which means it will be Pathfinder night. It is Kingmaker night. I may be a little bit later than normal for that night because I do have an advisory board meeting for Project New Hope that I have to go to. But when I am done there, I will be here and we'll get back to Kingmaker, a Pathfinder adventure on Foundry VTT. And then, of course, Thursday will be Stompy Mech night. I hope you guys all have yourselves a wonderful evening, a fantastic day tomorrow, until hopefully I see you then. Good night, everybody. Oh, I should mention before I go, thank you to all of you. The greatest gift that you can give to a streamer is the gift of your time. And I appreciate that you guys gave me the gift of yours this evening, whether it was for 5 minutes or for 3 hours. Either way, thank you for being here. Good night, everybody.